Hey, what's going on, guys? So I set out to make a video comparing the X27 amp and the X77 amp, which for this video I'm just going to be referring to as the 27 and the 77 because I just want to make it very, very clear that your prism does not matter at all. Whenever I talk about amps, I always get the question like, what prism are you using? What's the best prism? You can use whatever the fuck you want, okay? It doesn't actually matter. I would just suggest taking whatever you like the best and using that as your prism, because the only thing you're going to be doing with the prism in the Eidolon hunt is dumping your Void Strike stacks. Other than that, it doesn't really matter, guys. I just wanted to clear up any potential confusion about that. And in order to really talk about the damage difference between these two amps, I first need to go over how we take down Eidolon shields. So this video is going to serve as like a comprehensive Eidolon shield video, as well as going over the damage difference between the 27 and 77 amps, as well as why people use Magus melt. But first, let's start off by talking about what damage multipliers we're using to increase our operator damage against Eidolon shields. And the reason that we use operators against Eidolon shields is because they're the only way in the game that we can deal void damage, which is the damage type that works on Eidolon shields. You can have as much heat, electricity, whatever other element you want on your amp, but it won't actually increase your damage against the Eidolon shields, only increasing your void damage will, which is going to be important later on when I'm talking about shields as well as the Magus melt. There are three main ways to increase operator void damage against Eidolon shields: Unara Wisp, Void Strike, and Volt shields. And it's by using these three damage multipliers together that we're able to then one-shot the Eidolon shields every single phase. So let's start out with the most basic one, Unara Wisp. Unara Wisp is an Unara-only focus ability. And the way it works is that whenever you hit an enemy with a Void Blast, it's going to drop this little wisp on the ground. Then when an operator picks up this wisp, that operator will then deal 2 times the damage for the duration of the Unara Wisp buff, which at max rank is 12 seconds. So it's basically just a 2 times multiplier to whatever your amp damage is. Hopefully that's a pretty simple and self-explanatory ability. You pick up the wisp, your damage is multiplied by 2. The second multiplier we have here is Void Strike. Void Strike's an ability that while your operator is in void mode, which is just the operator crouch, you continually gain a stacking damage buff that scales infinitely until you get out of void mode, which is usually just when you run out of operator energy. So you can see here that when my operator leaves void mode, I have a little multiplier in the top right hand corner of the screen that shows how much I've stacked it up to. Now this damage buff is only going to count for your next 8 pellets fired, which means that every 8 shots you're going to have to go back into void mode to start stacking the buff again. And typically if you're in an Eidolon group, one person's going to be running Unaru and the other 3 are going to be running Madurai for Void Strike. That way the 3 Void Strike users can pick up an Unara Wisp, whose buff then works as a separate multiplier to the Void Strike. So if you have like a 3 times Void Strike multiplier and a 2 times Unara Wisp multiplier, it'll be a 6 times multiplier overall. Because 3 times 2 is 6. Pretty simple. Now, Volt Shields are a more conditional buff, and we use them to double our crit damage, because if you shoot through 1 Volt Shield, your crit damage is then going to be doubled. Now keep in mind that this only works on critical hits, so if you don't crit, then you don't get this double damage buff, which is one of the reasons that critting is so important on the Eidolons. You're going to lose out on a substantial portion of damage if you don't get a critical hit against an Eidolon. Now Volt Shields also have another buff. They add 50% electricity damage to each of your shots per Volt Shield. So you can have up to 6 Volt Shields for 300% increased electricity damage. But remember, the electricity damage has no effect on the Eidolon shields. So stacking multiple Volt Shields in front of your operator to deal additional damage to the Eidolon shields isn't actually going to increase your damage. We're only using 1 Volt Shield with operators to give us a 2 times damage multiplier on our crit damage, which is why we care even more about crit damage on our amps, in addition to the fact that crits already do increase damage. And that's the reason we're using the Certus Brace on our amps to increase our critical hit chance. It's the only thing we care about. But that's basically how we multiply our amps damage against Eidolon shields. A simple formula for this is taking the amp's base damage multiplied by the Unara Wisp buff, multiplied by the Void Strike buff, and then doubled by the Volt Shield. But remember, this is assuming that we're dealing a crit to the Eidolon. And in order to deal crits to the Eidolon, we're going to be using the Virtuos Shadow Arcane. This Arcane gives our amps an additional 60% crit chance whenever we get a headshot, which for the Eidolons we proc by dashing at the head with our operator. It takes a little practice, but once you get used to it, it's pretty simple. So with this buff, the 27 and 77 amps have a 64% chance to crit and an 80% chance to crit respectively. However, this crit chance does not account for the 27 amp hitting the Eidolon multiple different times, because the Shraksun Scaffold, which is the 2 part of the 27, has an initial shot as well as an explosion. And in addition to that, the initial shot can pierce through the Eidolon, hitting it multiple different times before exploding. And each of these different hits can crit. So the 64% crit chance that we get with a buff isn't actually telling us the probability that we get a crit. If we were to only assume we're going to hit the Eidolon twice, once with the initial shot and once with the explosion, the probability of one of those shots being a crit goes up to 87%. If the initial shot of the Shraksun Scaffold were to hit the Eidolon twice before exploding, that probability would then go up to 95%. If it were to hit 3 times, that probability would be 98%. So as you can see, the probability of getting a crit with the Shraksun Scaffold is much more consistent than the 7.7 amp, which has a 1 in 5 chance of not critting. Whereas with the Shraksun Scaffold, if you're properly positioned, you should always get a crit, basically. And I will say that during my testing, there's a variance on how many times the Shraksun Scaffold is actually going to hit the Eidolon, and it's going to depend heavily on how you're positioned. So you should be behind the leg, facing up, kind of like this, which usually gives 2 to 3 instances of puncture damage and 1 instance of an explosion damage. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about base amp damage versus the Eidolons. The Eidolons take reduced damage from all sources, and I'm not entirely sure how this applies, so I don't have like a formula here to explain why the damage is what it is. But this is a completely separate damage modifier from, say, like armor. And it's nothing to worry about. This has been the same way forever. But just as an example here, if you take the Propa Scaffold, which deals 9,000 damage, and use it against an Eidolon, that damage then becomes 414 non-crit damage, which is just a really weird damage modifier, because if you were to then crit, which you would assume would deal twice as much damage because the Propa Scaffold has a 2 times critical multiplier, the critical hit will actually deal 1,494 damage, which is basically a 4 times damage multiplier for crit damage against the Eidolons. And I haven't found any explanation for this, but it works on both amps, and I don't really understand the reason why. But basically, this makes crits very, very important because you get a 4 times damage modifier. And if you don't crit, you don't get this damage modifier, and your crit also doesn't get doubled by the Volt Shield. So I keep saying this, but crits are so important against the Eidolons, if not the most important thing. And the last bit of information I want to go over is the Eidolon's shield numbers. So basically, the Eidolons start with full shields. The Teralyst has 47,000, the Gantulyst has 57,000, and the Hydrolyst has 67,000. Hopefully you guys are sensing a pattern here. They basically just have 10,000 shields more than their predecessor. And for every shield after the first shield, assuming that you have it tethered with a lure, that's going to be half that number, which is going to be the number you want to reach with your amp for every subsequent phase after initially taking down the Eidolon shields. So for this video, I'm just going to be using the Hydrolyst half shields at 33,000 for an example, which I think gives us enough information to then compare the 2.7 and the 7.7 amps. Let's start with the 7.7 because it's a lot simpler to understand. The 7.7 deals 414 non-crit damage and 1,494 crit damage. And Hydrolyst will have exactly 33,884 shields after the first break. So basically we need to know how much Void Strike it takes for a 1,494 damage shot to then take down the Hydrolyst's halved shields. So with this shot, I'm assuming that we have a Lunar Wisp as well as a Volt Shield, which gives us two 2 times multipliers or a ×4 multiplier if you want to simplify it. With those 2 multipliers active, we then have 5,976 damage. To figure out how much of a Void Strike multiplier we need, we simply divide the Eidolon shields by the 5,976, which then gives us a 5.6 times multiplier. I will say here that these numbers are rough and you may need more or less of a Void Strike stack. And that's just because I don't really understand how the damage is being modified versus the Eidolon. So take this more as like an example than like cold hard facts. So with a Void Strike stack of about 6, you should be able to one-shot the Eidolon shields by yourself. But remember, there's a 25% chance to not crit. So let's look at those numbers. If you don't crit, you only hit the Eidolon for 414 damage, right? And you don't get the Volt Shield multiplier either. So with a 6 times Void Strike stack, the non-crit damage is going to be 4,968 damage. That's compared to the 33,000 damage that we're getting with a crit. That's a huge discrepancy, and I hope that highlights why it's important to get crits. But now let's take a look at the 2.7 amp because the numbers are lower, but the crit chance is higher. So with the 2.7 amp, we have 2 different crit chances. We have the crit chance for the initial shot that pierces, and we have the crit chance for the explosion. And it's important because each of these have different damage numbers. The first part of the shot deals 141 non-crit damage and 561 crit damage. And the second part of the shot, the explosion, deals 261 non-crit damage and 801 crit damage. For our purposes here, I'm going to assume that the initial shot only hits twice and the explosion only hits once, which is pretty reasonable, I think, because there's a variance on how many times these shots actually hit. This is not a black and white example because I'm going to be dealing with probabilities here just to warn you. So the probability that at least one of these is going to be a crit is 95%. But because at least from my testing, it seems that the initial hit can only crit once, even if it hits multiple times, the chance for you to get both a crit on the initial hit as well as the explosion is only 55%. So here we have 3 different basic outcomes. We get a crit either on the initial hit, we get a crit on the explosion, or we get a crit on both. So let's look at the numbers for all of these. If both the initial shot and the explosion were to crit, you would only need a 5.9 times damage multiplier from your Void Strike. If only one of the initial shots were to crit, you would need an 11 times damage multiplier from your Void Strike in order to reach that same level of damage. And finally, if the explosion were to crit and the initial shot didn't, you would need a 9 times damage multiplier to get that same level of damage. So because the Shraksun Scaffold has a lower base damage than the Propa Scaffold, you're going to need a higher Void Strike stack in order to reach that same level of damage. But the Shraksun Scaffold only has a 5% chance to not crit, meaning that your damage on average is going to be higher with the Shraksun Scaffold against the shields than it will with the Propa Scaffold. Because again, with the Propa Scaffold, you have a 25% chance not to crit, and when you don't crit with either of these two amps, they do abysmal damage. But I know a lot of people have been using the Propa Scaffold in combination with Magus Melt on the Eidolons. And the reason for this is that the Propa Scaffold is actually able to take out the Eidolon limbs fairly easily with a relatively low Void Strike stack, by using Magus Melt in combination with the Volt Shield. And while you can technically do the exact same thing with the Shraksun Scaffold, it's a little wonkier just because the projectile pierces through the Eidolon, which makes it harder to hit specific limbs. Plus, as we just went over, the base damage is lower. But basically the way that Magus Melt works, if you're unfamiliar with it, is that as you dash with your operator, it'll stack 20% heat damage per dash up to 5 times. So basically you dash 5 times with Magus Melt into the ground and it gives you 100% heat damage. This heat damage is applied to your operator's amp, and when you shoot through a Volt Shield with the heat damage, it'll actually turn it into radiation damage, which hopefully by this point you guys know is good against the Eidolons. And if you want, you can also stack the Volt Shields up to 6 times for that extra 300% increased electricity damage. Although stacking Volt Shields that many times in a real run is pretty impractical. And once you have this radiation damage, you can then potentially kill the Eidolon limbs with your operator. Although with a 25% chance not to crit, as well as the fact that you need to take down the Eidolon's shield first before you can damage the limb, it becomes less and less likely that you're going to do this reliably. Because while you can overkill the shield and damage the limb, most likely you're going to actually be expending 2 different Void Strike stacks, first to take down the shield and then again to take down the limb, which is really the Chroma's job. And most good Chromas will alternate which side of the Eidolon they shoot. This way the Eidolon just walks back and forth between 2 different positions. And if for whatever reason you kill the wrong side of the Eidolon with your operator, it could confuse the whole process, which is why I think ultimately this is best left up to the Chroma. But basically by stacking damage on the Propa Scaffold, you can kind of act as a backup limb DPS for Chroma. Although this isn't going to replace Chroma for the Eidolon hunts. You still need Chroma for the head, and on top of that, positioning with the Propa Scaffold can be difficult. Because as you can see here, it only shoots out like 2 meters in front of you. And in order to maximize your damage, you need the Volt Shield to be in between you and the Eidolon hitbox, and because the Eidolon hitbox is so big, it can be very hard to position properly for the Propa Scaffold. Because you want it to pass through the shield, but you also want it to detonate immediately on contact with the Eidolon, which gives you a very narrow range to work with. And outside of doing something like a 5x3 where you have organized people and a Volt that knows exactly where to put the shield, I don't see this being practical. And I also just want to clarify real quick what I mean by detonate immediately. So the way the Propa Scaffold works is you lob out like a grenade and then it detonates either when it comes into contact with something or after a set duration of time. Now for the Eidolons, we want it to blow up directly on impact, because if you have to wait for the duration to actually end, you're going to be wasting time during your hunt. And wasting time when you're trying to go as fast as possible is just bad. So just to wrap things up, my thoughts on the 2.7 is that it has lower damage but a higher reliability in taking down the Eidolon shields. And the 7.7, while it does have higher damage, it's also more difficult to use properly. And while you can potentially take out limbs during the Eidolon hunt, that's really the Chroma's job, and you should be relying on your Chroma to do that. Although you're not going to lose much by putting a Magus Melt on your operator build, and you're going to be proccing Magus Melt very consistently since you're going to be dashing at the Eidolon's head to get your Virtuos Shadow up. But I'm hoping that this video at least cleared up the differences between the 2.7 and the 7.7 amps for Eidolons. Both are very usable and can be good options so long as you understand how they work and why. Personally, for me, I like the 2.7 more, but if you like using the 7.7, then that's totally fine. I would though caution anybody who's doing under 5x3s to not use the 7.7 amp just because it's going to be more unreliable the less organized your group is. I hope my logic there makes sense. And if you have any questions or if there's something I missed, please leave a comment below and I'll do my best to get back to you. And if you found the video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button and make sure to subscribe for future content. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. Hope you're all having a good one, and I'll see you later.